Welcome. My name is Lillian Anderson, and I am a member of Reclaim Our Democracy here at First Parish in Concord. Reclaim Our Democracy has been in existence since 2016 with a focus on helping to build a powerful nationwide democracy movement in order to repair our broken election system. Our focus this year is on a nationwide Unitarian Universalist initiative called UU the Vote, which will work to mobilize young and underrepresented groups of voters, challenge voter suppression, and hold values-based conversations on issues that matter most, such as democracy, racial justice, environment, and inequity. You can learn more about this effort at the table where you came in. Before we begin, you should be aware that tonight's program is being recorded and will be available to view on the internet. There will be lots of time at the end for questions and answers after Nancy speaks. And after that, we will have a book signing over here. The signing is over here. The purchase is over here. And just to give you a few logistics, if you've not been at First Parish, our restrooms are downstairs, either near the front entrance, and you go down the stairs, or over here by the exit on my right. And just a reminder to turn off your cell phones. So, to get us started, let me bring Ted Bain forward. Ted was very instrumental in getting this wonderful event to happen here tonight. Thank you, Ted. And Ted will introduce Nancy.
Just a few introductory things I'd like to say about our guest speaker. I think you already have seen that she's the William Chafee Professor of History. I think it's Distinguished Professor of History is the correct, at least that's what I saw on the Duke website. She's an award-winning author, scholar, and teacher. And in addition to Democracy in Chains, which is the basis for her talk tonight, there are two other books that I want to call to your attention. She wrote Freedom is Not Enough, published in 2008. And in this work, she shows how African-American and later Mexican-American civil rights activists and feminists concluded that freedom alone would not suffice. Access to jobs at all levels is a requisite for full citizenship. The book won 7 awards, including the Taft Award for Labor History and the Hearst Award for Legal History. And Kenneth Mack at Harvard praised Nancy for having helped reintegrate legal frameworks into the discussion of civil rights after it had been neglected by historians. Another book, written before that, called Behind the Mask of Chivalry, traced the remarkable growth and northern spread of the second KKK in the period between 1915 and 1930. It was based on her dissertation at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and it received 4 scholarly awards. And it's had a hit recently because of Trump, I think, that people have become interested in this book, which was written in 1994. Nancy has publicly spoken more than 200 times on the subject of Democracy in Chains, not to mention YouTubed interviews on the same subject. While she is certainly comfortable in the ivory tower, this level of outreach to her readership and beyond has had intended consequences that remind me of good old social justice activism, but I won't tell. And she's also been out there in state politics in North Carolina. So we're really happy she's agreed to speak here at First Parish in Concord. Nancy, welcome.
Thank you, Ted. Good evening. It is such a great pleasure to be here and such an honor to be here for a historian. I know some of the history of this church And I learned today, in fact, that Frederick Douglass had spoken in the earlier version of this church before the fire. I'm told there's a couch downstairs that I have to visit before I leave, because I'm currently teaching a course that I teach on the history of social movements, and we read Frederick Douglass earlier in the semester and looked at the abolition movement. So I think my students will be pretty excited when I come home with that photo and story. But I would like to thank Ted for bringing me here, and Fred Van Dusen, who couldn't be with us tonight. Again, it is just such a pleasure to be here. We were able to go to the Alcott House today, which has special meaning for me when I was, a young woman writer. So thrilled to be here, and also impressed at the size of the Social Action Committee in this church and the number of good people here from the League of Women Voters, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. And my friend Jeff Clement is somewhere out there from American Promise, democracy group that's based here. So really looking forward to the discussion. I think you all know that our political system is in serious trouble in this country, that it has been going in some ways from bad to worse in Washington and the states over the last decade. You don't need to have reminders of that or talk about how bad it is. You probably did some of that at dinner, perhaps, and that's why you're here on a Saturday night in such numbers. I appreciate that. What you might be struggling to figure out, though, and perhaps part of the reason you're here on this lovely Saturday night, is that you're... Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Tomorrow I'm with my sister. I don't know, it's a weekend night, right? You're right. Whoops, I get ahead of myself sometimes. Yes, anyway, a weekend night. So it's good that you're here and that we can talk about this, because we really need to understand what has happened to our country and why. And I think most of you here have a sense of some of the currents that have fed this watershed that we've reached today. They certainly include the kind of movement conservatism that made Barry Goldwater the Republican candidate for president in 1964, just after his vote against the Civil Rights Act of that year. These currents also include the religious right, which became so prominent in the 1970s and thereafter. And there is also a white supremacist right that has resurged with a vengeance over the last several years. All of these are important, I want to be clear, and all of these have together helped yield the votes that are being used to drive through radical policy change. But what I want to talk with you about tonight is another piece of the puzzle of how we got into the dangerous situation in which we find ourselves. And this is a missing piece that you may not have encountered before, but I think it explains a lot that otherwise remains mysterious. And that is the ideas that are guiding the billionaire-funded radical libertarian right, made famous or notorious, depending on your perspective, by Charles Koch. And I believe that knowing about these ideas and understanding how the Koch network's operations have weaponized these ideas is important, not only in its own right to better understand what is happening now and why and how, but I think it's also important to equip us to deal with the crisis that we're facing. Because I do believe, and I think you'll see as we go along and get into the discussion, that citizen action is going to be really crucial to solving this problem. And as a public health nurse who read the book and wrote to me put it, she said, I realized that we need to get the diagnosis right before we can determine the best treatment plan. And I think that is a really helpful analogy for our situation, that we really need to understand at a deep level where this is all coming from. Why does this matter so much? Because there is an unmarked danger in our situation right now, which is that the noisiest threats are getting the most attention, above all, those coming from the White House. Now, as this figure that I've come to think about as the distractor in chief, and I think you'll see why as we go along, draws nearly all attention from the media and from most of us on a daily basis, in fact, a more extreme plan is moving along apace in our country. It is moving along in the 30 states, now totally dominated by this cause. It is moving along in federal departments and agencies, and it is moving along in the courts. This plan that I'll be talking about is being pursued by a much smaller number, but a number of people who are archly determined and who are breathtakingly well-funded. And this causes architects aim to rewrite the rules of our society permanently. To do so, they have shown that they are willing and, in fact, quite determined to use these other sections of the right, the more popular sections of the right, the religious right and the movement conservatism that remade the Republican Party over years, and even that alt-right that we are now seeing so much of, determined to use these if they need to get what they want in the knowledge that they otherwise could not achieve it because they don't have the numbers. So I'll state my case very simply to start with, so we're all clear on where I'm going, and that is that behind all the seeming chaos and dysfunction in our public life right now, there is a strategy in play, a cold-eyed, calculated strategy. And that strategy is far along. One of its field generals said this in late 2015, and I'm quoting, "We're close to winning. They don't have the real path. They don't have the real path." That was Mark Holden, then the head of Koch Industries government and public affairs operation, gloating to an invitation-only audience of billionaire and multimillionaire donors at what is called the Koch seminar. Mark Holden is now the number 2 person in the Koch operations. Now, all of you, I'm sure, here tonight have heard and read a great deal over many years now, almost a decade, about the fortune that Charles Koch has been investing in our politics. But what you've likely not heard much about is the ideas, the technology, as Koch refers to them, with his 3 MIT degrees, by the way. He's a kind of a local product, you could say. The ideas that have made those investments lately so devastatingly effective. And he actually said at a donor summit last year to the assembled over 600 members of his donor network, "We have made more progress together over the last 5 years than I was able to make over the previous 50. So he's been at this for a very long time, but has a sense that now things are coming to fruition. And I learned through my research that it was an academic economist who taught Charles Koch that for capitalism of the kind of pure, one could say imaginary version that they believe in to thrive, democracy must be enchained. Hence my title, Democracy in Chains. Not overthrown as in a coup, but instead rigged, quietly, incrementally, and strategically rigged so that it can no longer provide what citizens have looked to government to provide for generations now. From public education, to retirement security, to protection from discrimination, to taking care of our water and air quality, and now our planet. So my research provides a backstory on this defining moment in which we find ourselves, as it also explains that real path to which Mark Holden referred. At its core, the book is a story of 2 men, a thinker and a CEO whose lives converged beginning about 1970 through a shared commitment to transform the model of government that our country built up over the course of the 20th century. The thinker was a Tennessee-born economist, a man named James McGill Buchanan, who spent most of his career in Virginia public institutions of higher education. You'll see why that's an irony as I go along. And the CEO is, of course, the Kansas-based Charles Koch, who, in addition to building the company he inherited into one of the largest privately held corporations in the world, Koch Industries, spent most of his leisure time in his adult life trying to find a way to make our country conform to this arch vision of economic liberty, essentially a kind of free reign capitalism, you could say, beyond the reach of voters and their governments. So the history that my book conveys is, first of all, of the crucible in which Buchanan came up with this idea of enchaining democracy to insulate economic liberty. And that was an interesting moment. It was as the civil rights movement was remaking his adopted state of Virginia, his own new campus at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, and the nation as a whole in the late 1950s and 60s. Then the focus turns to how Charles Koch began funding an apparatus to make that idea a reality in a messianic quest that has produced the situation we are now confronting. So that's kind of the picture of my findings. But tonight, rather than retell the book story, what I want to do is share with you the story of how I stumbled on the trail that led me to these findings. Because I actually did not go looking for either of these men who loom so large in this book. You could say they found me in the archives. And I think that knowing the route that led me to the pretty stark conclusions I've just shared with you will in fact give you an even sharper sense of the stakes of this project. Because it turns out that what we are seeing now, what we have been seeing over the last several years, is not the first time that the libertarian right in America has shown itself willing to exploit white supremacy to advance a project that I've come to think about as property supremacy. A property supremacy that will have its most devastating impact on people of limited means, and particularly people who have long been denied access to full citizenship, above all African Americans and other people of color and women, but a property supremacy that will ultimately affect us all if it succeeds and will in fact lead to catastrophe for our planet. So let me pause and say what led me to conclude all this. I could tell you, in a word, serendipity. As I said, I never went looking for this story. I'm a historian of social movements in the US, as I think Ted signaled, and I have a particular interest in the American South. And in 2006, I had just finished one of the books that he mentioned, when I happened to go into an archive of the American Friends Service Committee that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And in the archive, I came across a display of materials from Prince Edward County, Virginia. And it told the tragic story, these materials told the tragic story of what happened in this county in the old plantation belt of Virginia when white county officials answered the US Supreme Court's call to desegregate their public schools without further delay by, as these white county officials put it, and I quote, going out of the public school business entirely. They shuttered every public school in Prince Edward County. They padlocked the doors, they posted no trespassing signs, and they sent white children off to a subsidized private segregation academy while leaving black children with absolutely no formal education whatsoever. And they kept those schools closed for 5 years until the courts compelled them to reinstate a public school system. So I was shocked. That is somebody with my research interests. I had never heard of that story. There's actually since been a couple of good books that have come out about it, but it was new to me. And so I started to research this, and in fairly short order, learned that tax-funded school vouchers provided by the state were crucial to this kind of massive resistance, as they proudly called it, to Brown versus Board of Education. I also discovered that the Chicago libertarian economist, Milton Friedman, I'm sure many of you are familiar with his book, Capitalism and Freedom, and we actually have someone who is in his program who may address us later. Milton Friedman, I learned, issued his first manifesto for such tax-funded school vouchers in 1955. The year after Brown versus Board of Education, in the full knowledge of how that call would be used by segregationist state governments in the South. And I know that because I saw the correspondence with an editor who challenged him on all the points that we might raise today. So Friedman became part of my story, and I thought, well, this is interesting. This project that we've come to know, as some people call it free market fundamentalism, others call it neoliberalism. We're told that it took off in the 1970s with stagflation, but here they were, messing around in Virginia and the segregated South, trying to drum up support for school vouchers in the crisis of the late 1950s and 1960s. So I thought, this is a new story we need to know, so I dug in. But in following a footnote, I learned of a 1959 report as the threat from Prince Edward County was in the air to close the schools that fall because they had been delaying and dragging their feet. And this report was issued by two other economists, neither of whom I'd ever heard about, but both were trained at the University of Chicago, and they had recently set up a new center at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. One of them was this James McGill Buchanan. This report that they issued was an attempt to refute a movement by then that included moderate whites, particularly mothers and liberal clergy, who were trying to save Virginia's public education system from the massive resistors, from the segregationists who were trying to take all this public money to protect their segregated academies beyond the reach of the courts. So how did these economists fight? They did so by making a case that if the state sold off all its facilities to private operators, it could provide better education with liberty. In this case, the relevant liberty being liberty from the federal courts because these schools would be beyond reach of the desegregation decision. So they were in effect calling for privatizing Virginia's public schools before that was even a verb in our national vocabulary. And they did so in the knowledge that the schools that would be funded in this way would be white segregation academies, because those were the only private schools in question at this point. Black parents and their organizations rejected this massive resistance voucher plan to a person and saw it as an insult to the constitutional dignity that had just been recognized in the Brown decision. And they said, look, parents are free to send their kids to private schools, but no one has the right to have their prejudices subsidized by tax dollars. So this was what Buchanan and his colleague were trying to refute. So it stunned me, I have to say, as a professor myself, to see two scholars, cosmopolitan scholars. Buchanan just returned from a trip to Italy. He read in 5 languages. And here they were making a case for what their state's most arch segregationists were seeking. And it also intrigued me that they did this not in racial terms, like so many of the people whose side they were effectively taking, but in economic terms, self-consciously leveraging the authority of the discipline of economics and Buchanan's position as the new chair of the economics department at what locals in Charlottesville call Mr. Jefferson's University, since that university was designed and founded by Thomas Jefferson. They knew that they were exploiting the rage of segregationists to move their libertarian economic agenda. Their cover letter to legislators with their report, in fact, said that they were speaking out, and I quote, letting the chips fall where they may. It's actually the title of one of the chapters, because the phrase so stuck with me, making clear that they understood full well the harm they would be inflicting, but they thought that that was worthwhile to move this libertarian economic agenda. And so as an educator myself, I became curious, frankly wondering how anyone could do such a thing. Not in an irrational frenzy of the kind that many of us, I think, today associate with white supremacy in the South in this period, but actually in cold-eyed calculation to move their own agenda. So with my curiosity piqued, I began seeking more information about this James McGill Buchanan. I learned that he had gone on to be awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 1986. He was awarded the prize for having pioneered a new way of thinking called public choice economics, which I learned also became influential in political science and law, and most importantly, among activists and elected officials on the political right. So what Buchanan did that was new in his phrase was the economic analysis of politics, the economic analysis of politics. But it was a distinctive economic analysis. What he did was apply libertarian economic assumptions to public actors to argue that they could only be understood as individuals rationally seeking their own personal self-interest, not the common good as they claimed. So it was a debunking effort from the start. He pointed, for example, to how elected officials answered organized citizens with programs that they could tax others for. And he portrayed these organized citizens labor unions, civil rights groups, and others as rent seekers. If you hear that phrase, you know you're dealing with these folks. As rent seekers who were trying to use collective power to get what they could not get as individuals from the ordinary workings of a market economy, a practice that he portrayed as illegitimate. So as a thinker who specialized in public finance, how the government gets revenue and spends revenue, and a figure who identified with the political right in the South and in the nation, he made it his career mission to find ways to shrink the expanding public sector and to break down the trust and legitimacy in government that prevailed at that moment when trust in government was over 90%. And I think it's important to remember this era that he was working in. So this is after the Cold War. It's in the period when the government was financing public higher education at really significant levels, making essentially free college available to many working class people. It was financing the systems of public roads. It was financing scientific research and all of these things. Buchanan and libertarians thought that this was all illegitimate. The government had no business doing this. So he turned new attention to what he liked to call the rules of the game of politics, to the taxing and spending incentives of the political process and how altering the rules of that process could change the outcomes. And I want to be clear here and say that public choice ideas have influenced some who are not on the political right, including, we were talking about this earlier, Cass Sunstein, who teaches at Harvard Law School, wrote a book called Nudged, worked on regulatory matters with the Obama administration. So that is certainly true, that there are more people who have found these ideas useful to think with. But as I dug into this, I also found that Buchanan's version of this larger school, often called the Virginia School of Political Economy, was always distinctive. And he himself said, looking back from a documentary made in 2007, that when he set to work in the late 1950s and 1960s, the idea of the public interest was dominant, the idea of the common good. And he said, that's what I wanted to tear down. The hypocrisy of calling something in the public interest. Again, this was a new world to me. So I thought, why in heaven's name would anyone want to tear down the idea of the public interest, right? Or the common good? This is the staple of deliberative democracy from the Greeks forward, that we try to persuade one another. If you persuade enough people to act on it, then we say it's in the public interest and the common good. But no, they said there's no such thing. And I found, as I dug in to try to understand this, that to a libertarian like Buchanan, any such notion of common good, of public interest, of shared purpose, they believe will lead government to coerce those who don't agree with the majority. And the minority he was concerned with, and he wrote 20 volumes of collected works, had a huge rambling house full of papers from over 60 years of work. The only minority I ever saw him expressing any significant concern with was the minority of wealthy taxpayers and CEOs who didn't share the majority's conception of the public interest. So it was their liberty he was concerned with. And he was at pains to argue, in effect, that we should not be our brother's keepers, right? At least we should not be able to use government to shift tax revenues from one citizen to another. He was so determined in this that he wrote an article that I talk about in the book in 1975 called The Samaritan's Dilemma, where he used game theory to go back to the Bible and the parable of the Good Samaritan, which I think everybody in this room understands is the heart of the universalistic ethics of Christianity, right? To say that everyone is our neighbor, not just the people who look like you or live next door. Everyone is our neighbor that we must care for. Well, Buchanan said, not in the modern world. And he actually used lines like, modern man has become too compassionate, may have become too compassionate for his survival as a species and for the continuation of a free and productive economy. And so the burden of this article was to convince readers that the people who were like the Jew helped by the Good Samaritan, beaten up, lying on the roadside, robbed, left to die, those people were the predators. You had to be careful of them because they might exploit you, right? So this is actually like an argument in an economics venue to say that the ethics of Jesus really should not apply in the modern world because it will lead to the exploitation of the givers. I don't make this up. Okay, he also came to talk about all of this in very stark terms that are now quite widespread on the right, and you can hear crude versions of this public choice thought any day on right-wing talk radio. But you can also hear it in more mainstream venues. So a case in point, how many of you remember the 2012 election when a tape came out where a server had recorded Mitt Romney telling donors at a $50,000 a plate fundraising dinner that 47% of the public would never vote for him because they were too dependent on government? People remember that? We're all so shocked, and many pundits think that cost Romney the election. But interestingly, at that time, we didn't really know who the Kochs were or any of this stuff about public choice. So we thought it was just Romney. But it turns out that Romney wasn't doing anything new or original in that speech. In fact, by then, the Heritage Foundation, which advised him and Trump and everybody else, which is funded by Charles Koch, which James Buchanan worked with, the Heritage Foundation was by then maintaining what they call the annual index of dependency, derived from this public choice economics to discredit those who need to look to government for more than they're paying in taxes. And it was Buchanan who really gained, and his team of people that he trained, who gave scholarly legitimacy to this kind of thinking. And he really did not hold back, even in scholarly writing. He spoke of net tax recipients, those who receive more from government at a given point than they are paying in, as, and I quote, parasites on the productive. He warned of predators and prey. The predators would be, say, public school teachers organizing together to try to get more money for public school classes, environmentalists cleaning up brownfields, senior citizens seeking a prescription drug benefit. All of these are parasites on the productive, and they are the predators, and the wealthy taxpayers and corporations are the prey of these collective efforts ganging up on them. So needless to say, as I understood from my first book that was mentioned by Ted, this kind of vocabulary, parasites, predators, prey, made millions of his fellow citizens look like menaces, not even fully human. It's a kind of vocabulary that is dehumanizing, it is disinhibiting, it is a vocabulary that licenses hostility and makes it legitimate. And again, it is a vocabulary that is rife on the right today. And once your ear is attuned to it, you will see it all over. As I read more, I also learned that for those who think this way, social justice is a very simple matter. I keep what I earn, you keep what you earn. And you, collectively, can only tax me if I agree with all of your goals and purposes. And in fact, Buchanan's colleague at his last home, George Mason, says this on the conservative political action circuit. He may also be the only African-American scholar who is pro the Confederacy. But that's a story for another time. Anyway, Buchanan himself didn't stop with these kinds of assertions. He believed passionately that he was right, that his cause was legitimate, that the world he wanted to preserve of liberty was imperiled. And so in the 1970s, he shifted from, well, he continued doing scholarship, but he also moved into organizing. He began actively urging elected officials on the political right and donors on the right to help build up a counterintelligentsia, as he put it, and he said to them that the way to do that was, and I quote, creating a gravy train. a gravy train that would bring men into the libertarian fold and train them for battle against this system that he found so illegitimate, and to fight for economic liberty. While doing this kind of organizing, he also shifted from diagnosis, from saying what he thought was wrong, to prescription, what should happen. He believed that by this measure of protecting that minority of unwilling taxpayers and unwilling people being regulated from their majority fellow citizens, every constitution in the world was a failure. These folks were not adequately protected in their liberty. So he set out to design a constitutional regime that could, as some of his colleagues put it, protect capitalism from government, that could enshrine the rights of the wealthy minority to a degree that no society anywhere had ever seen. He turned to this project at a propitious moment, beginning in 1975, and that was after the military junta of Augusto Pinochet came to power in Chile, and it was at a particular moment when they had crushed all the domestic opposition to the dictatorship, but they were facing intense international pressure to return to an elected representative system of government, but they didn't want to go back until they were able to lock in all they had done when they had kept the people from exercising any power, including privatization of Social Security, privatization of education, and privatization of health care. So they needed to find a way to do that. In 1980, the dictatorship invited Buchanan to Santiago to try out these ideas for how to devise a constitution that would protect capitalism from government. And in fact, the result of that advice is still in place today. It's called the Constitution of Liberty. If any of you follows Chilean affairs, there were unprecedented demonstrations in late 2019 about this. Like the proportion of Chileans on the street is bigger than any population ever on the street against this constitution, with people killed, horrible things happening, but basically the commitment is to get rid of this binding constitution, which one elected official, Michelle Bachelet, had put locks and bolts on what the government could do in Chile. And that's actually, I use that as a title for a chapter for what they did in Chile. And the reason that's important is not just in its own right, but because it's a case of what the National Archives' beautiful slogan says, the past is prologue. Because now, this kind of constitution, a constitution of locks and bolts, is coming to the United States. Thanks to pressure from the Koch donor network, which is determined to achieve the kind of binding restraints on the popular will that Buchanan urged, without informing the people of their true goals. And while the distractor-in-chief has been so busy getting our attention over here with the tweets and so forth, the organizing apparatus built up by these arch-right donors, above all, the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, and a Republican Party that the donors have all but taken over and turned into a delivery vehicle with a threat of well-funded primary challenges from the right. Using those forces, this cause now has in place 28 of the 34 states' authorizations needed to call the first constitutional convention in our history since 1787. Common Cause calls it the most serious threat to democracy, flying almost completely under the radar, and that it's an effort to essentially revoke the 20th century. It is an incredibly radical and reckless gambit, and it could potentially be a few years away, not so long in the future, depending on how things go. So we can certainly talk more about that in the discussion. But meanwhile, you might be wondering how I was able to put together the way that Buchanan's ideas were guiding this real path that the Koch network is following to shackle democracy by ultimately changing the Constitution. And the answer is, again, in good part, coincidence. I happened to move from Chicago to North Carolina in 2010, just as a radicalized Republican Party, dominated by Koch-backed Tea Party figures, won majorities in both houses of the state legislature. And suddenly, the things I was reading about in Buchanan's work that still seemed pretty abstract became incredibly concrete and clear as the General Assembly's top donor, a man named Art Pope, pictured here to your right, was a longtime Koch ally, boasted of the big bang, he called it, that his grantees were delivering to make this once moderate state a laboratory for the libertarian cause using measures derived from public choice thought. So to appreciate what happened in North Carolina and in other places like Wisconsin and many other states since, it's important to know that for many years building up to this point, Buchanan had urged his teammates to stop focusing on who rules and start thinking about the rules. And he said, if you don't like the outcome of public policy over a long period of time, and here you have to understand that the libertarians, and I'm a historian and I don't exaggerate, the libertarians despise the public policies of the 20th century. He said, if you don't like the outcome of public policy over a long period of time, stop focusing on who rules, right? The individuals, even the parties, and start focusing laser-like on the rules, right? And how you can change the rules to get the outcomes that you want. So, with that in mind, I can tell you that what unfolded in North Carolina with this new General Assembly was a stunning barrage of radical rules changes on precisely this model, one after another. Among them, the most extreme and sophisticated gerrymandering we have ever seen in our political history in America to ensure that elected officials could choose their voters rather than the other way around. New measures to undermine workers' ability to organize together in unions for collective voice, particularly public sector unions and particularly teachers' unions, which are actually the largest and the most effective liberal lobbies in today's America, alongside maybe Planned Parenthood, which also they despise because it's such a significant lobby for public health more generally. We also saw attacks on public education at all levels and radical cuts in funding for it while shifting tax revenues to unregulated private charter schools. We saw repeal of a Racial Justice Act. We saw refusal to accept the Medicaid expansion of the Affordable Care Act, despite a crying need for it in our low-wage state, for people who worked full-time but couldn't afford health care. And we saw measures to roll back environmental protection and reduce global warming. And here's Americans for Prosperity's head bragging about how they made our state a laboratory. We also saw this new majority break with customary governing practices like public hearings before passing significant legislation, transparency about the process. Instead, they worked with breakneck speed, often with secrecy, sometimes frankly convening after midnight when their colleagues were gone. I mean, I could tell you stories that would raise your hair about how they operated and still do. And then to cap it off, in 2012, when they won the governorship too, they passed what came to be known as the monster voter suppression bill, that in some 15 different ways tried to keep people who would be predictably opposed to this agenda away from the polls, including, by the way, young people, although many thought it was not legally actionable. So what proved so surreal to me as a scholar who was, doing this research and as a citizen is that I could see that this new Republican majority was applying Buchanan's ideas to get what they otherwise could not. Certainly not if they had campaigned openly for the policies that they were now rushing through. And in another weird coincidence, I had gone to graduate school in Wisconsin, where Governor Scott Walker was doing the same kind of thing at the same time, beginning with his so-called Act 10, taking away collective bargaining rights from public sector workers. But I could also see, because of my research, how the critics of all of this, really good people who were shocked at the sudden U-turns that their states were taking, were missing the deep operational strategy that unified these varying measures. So people kept thinking if they pointed out with research, how this would affect public health, kids in schools, et cetera, surely these people would change course. But what they didn't see is that these folks, and they were overwhelmingly men, these guys understood that they would be inflicting grievous harm on many of their fellow citizens, but they believed that their endgame was worth that price. They were, you could say, yet again, in cold calculation, letting the chips fall where they may. What my fellow critics of all of this also did not see, and I have to say it took me a good while to see it myself, was that this agenda was backed by an ethical system. Backed by an ethical system that gave these actors confidence and let them feel heroic enough to weather the criticism and opposition they were facing. I actually understand why people had such trouble recognizing an ethical system here. Even the brilliant Reverend William Barber, who has since received a MacArthur Genius Grant. The reason it was hard to recognize as an ethical system is because it actually runs counter to the best in every one of the world's major faith traditions. But it is an ethical system, and one that has a coherence that we need to understand if we're going to figure out how to deal with the crisis that the combination of Buchanan's ideas and Koch's money have created. So let me make this very plain with a single example. The libertarian morality deems it better to have people die from lack of health care than to receive it from government, from taxes paid for by others. Actually, one Koch-funded operative and now law professor at George Mason, Michael Grieve, said at the time the Affordable Care Act was passed, he said, "This bastard has to be killed as a matter of political hygiene." He went on to say, "I don't care if we drive a stake through its heart, if we strangle it or tar and feather it and drag it through the streets, this bastard has to be killed." He was quoted in the New York Times saying that. So why would they have to do this? Because ultimately, when they say personal responsibility, which may sound nice, I mean, we all believe in it at some level, right? We are trying to be personally responsible, but what they mean is something distinctive. They mean that ultimately in the system they want to create, every one of us should be personally responsible for all our needs, or they smuggle the family in, which means women doing unpaid work in many cases. But what they mean by that is the world they want to create won't have public schools, because they don't believe in those. There'll be private schools, and parents will have to save for their children's education as they save for their food and shelter. People will have to save in their own personal unemployment accounts, private accounts. You'll have to save for your health care in your private account, save for your retirement, etc. And of course, where would you have all those private accounts? With an unregulated financial sector. So you can imagine why they don't want to say this publicly to all of us, but this is where this is going. So what they seek, in short, is a world in which we are kept from using government by ironclad legal and constitutional rules. We are kept from using government to help ourselves and one another to achieve these common purposes by ironclad new rules. So I learned all of this and more in 2013 when James Buchanan died at the age of 93, and finally that September I was able to gain access to his private archive at George Mason University, his last institutional home. And there, in what they called Buchanan House, his own old working office complex in this old clapboard mansion, in records going back to the 1950s, I found my developing understanding of all of this confirmed, and confirmed in a way that just sometimes hit me viscerally. I'll give you one example. In his private office on the second floor, I found stacked helter-skelter on a chair a pile of documents that exposed how Charles Koch, some of his most trusted political operatives, George Mason economics faculty, the provost and the president, the dean of the law school, and a politically appointed board of visitors headed by Ed Meese, if you remember him, had together collaborated to establish a base camp for this highly political project at a public university just outside Washington, D.C. This was in 1997 when Charles Koch gave his first $10 million gift to George Mason. He's now the biggest donor, having given well over $100 million. And the idea was to support a big new center for political economy. Koch made it clear in the speech that accompanied his money that he wanted to see bold steps from this. He told the assembled grantees at the dinner, he said, "I want to unleash the kind of force that propelled Columbus to his discoveries." And he put in place operatives that would make sure that his investment delivered. One of them was a man named Richie Fink, a former colleague of James Buchanan who had gone on to become Koch's top political lieutenant. And he made clear that barging into the nation's higher education system was crucial to this political project because, as he has told donors, and I quote, "It's an integrated strategy that uses universities, think tanks, and political spending for the implementation of policy change." What kind of integrated political strategy? The dark money in the political spending should be a signal, a stealth strategy. A stealth strategy because the chief funder of this effort, Charles Koch, and the chief thinker behind the methods, knew that the vast majority would reject the goals they were trying to impose on the majority. And they knew this because history had shown it. Ronald Reagan talked the talk, backed up in his first budget. He said, I'm not going to hurt all those people, those Social Security recipients, those farmers, those veterans. I'll just run up the deficit. George W. Bush was a huge disappointment. He gave a prescription drug benefit to seniors, so they knew that any elected official who was accountable to the people would not carry through this agenda. So they had to change the rules and the incentives, and that is what they did. And in fact, Charles Koch said at the time, he said, what you see there, he said, because we are greatly outnumbered, the failure to use our superior technology, in other words, the strategy of these weaponized ideas, ensures failure. So to make the remainder of this story short, I think you would all probably agree that we have all felt the force of those investments since. And just as this did not, in fact, start with President Obama's election, as so many believe, it started well before it, but they used the reaction to it to their advantage. So just as it didn't start with Obama, so it will not stop with the Trump administration, however that happens. In closing, though, I want to pull back the lens from this flagship campus outpost to the overall Koch network project of social and political transformation without being honest with the people. When I brought home all the documents that I'd copied at Buchanan House and put them together with other sources that I had been accumulating, I found myself laying down pieces of a puzzle that I have to tell you left me just staggered in its scope and audacity. This Koch project now encompasses dozens of ostensibly separate national organizations, many of whose names will be familiar to you: the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the American Legislative Exchange Council, Americans for Prosperity, Freedom Partners Chamber of Commerce, the Federalist Society. I could go on. If you also include along with those the state-level operations that make up something called the State Policy Network, including your own Pioneer Institute, I believe it's called here, and the Beacon Hill Institute, that adds another 150 or so. There are also international affiliates of this that they are funding. So what we're talking about is hundreds of billionaire-funded organizations working to radically alter government and society to bring this kind of free-rein capitalism into being without being honest with the people about what they are doing and how. And as a historian of the American South, I came to realize something else. That the kind of government these men see as liberty, as the free society they speak of, would in fact look a lot like Virginia over the first 2/3 of the 20th century before the civil rights movement broke through. It would look like that in all but the state-forced racial segregation. When James Buchanan set to work in Charlottesville in 1956 with this new center that had an avowed mission, and I quote, to preserve liberty. Think about the work that word is doing in 1956 Virginia, to preserve liberty. The state had just been identified by the great political scientist V.O. Key as the most oligarchical state in the South and therefore in America. V.O. Key had kind of a wicked sense of humor. He wanted to drive home just how oligarchical Virginia was. So he said, next to Virginia, Mississippi is a hotbed of democracy. Think about it yourself in light of what I have shared here tonight and what you yourselves have witnessed over the last decade. What is the substance of this vision of liberty shared by the likes of James Buchanan and Charles Koch and the thousands of operatives funded by the Koch network, but mid-century Virginia, a state that had formally representative government, but in fact was subjected to the most thorough control by an oligarchy. As I said, oops, I got these slightly out of order. As I said, the state-mandated racial oppression would go. But we need to realize that just about everything else in the political economy of mid-century Virginia, and for that matter, the mid-century US South, enacts the libertarian rights dream. To give you just a few examples, and perhaps here I'll put up a list of Koch agenda items for you to look at while I talk about Virginia. A few examples, the use of right-to-work laws and other ploys to keep working people powerless, the suspicion of public education as a source of subversion, the regressive tax system and use of pay-as-you-go rules to prevent forward-looking public investments for future generations, the insistence that government should not be allowed to stop discrimination in deference to private property rights, the deployment of states' rights legal arguments to prevent the federal government from promoting equal treatment, the opposition to social insurance, such as Social Security and Medicare, and to the empowerment of workers through the Wagner Act, and these were led by this figure, Howard Byrd, in the Senate, and his Virginia colleague, Howard Smith, in the House. I said Howard, I think I meant to say Harry Byrd. And of course, to keep all this in play, voting rights restrictions, to keep those unlikely to support this agenda away from the polls. And another thing, gerrymandering. Gerrymandering to misrepresent the rest of the electorate. And scholars and political scientists have since shown that had the suburbs and the cities of Virginia had fair representation in the State House, this massive resistance legislation never would have passed that shut down these schools. So in short, what Virginia had then and what the radical right seeks now is a system of rigged rules. Rigged rules that in combination ensure the uncontested dominance of corporations and the wealthiest and most arch-right citizens. They seek, that is, to put democracy in chains. And I took my language from James Buchanan on that. So, the question that this stealth plan presents us with, once we know it, I believe is actually fairly simple. Is the kind of world that this cause is seeking to bring into being the kind of world that we want to live in, or the kind of world we want to leave for our children, or our grandchildren, and future generations? That, I believe, is the real public choice, and we are going to need to make it, I believe, within the next few years. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Happy to take your questions. And, oh, you're so kind. Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to take your question. Oh, yes, over here, sir. Oh, I think they're going to bring a mic around because of the videoing.
Hi.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have two questions. One, how does this dovetail in with the what the right did to insinuate itself into the establishment, the academic establishment and think tanks after the defeat of Barry Goldwater?
Uh-huh.
And the other may not be your field, but I just wonder what goes inside the heads of these people.
Thank you. I have struggled a lot with that myself. I'll actually here show you a slide that I went through before. Wait, where did it go? Are you seeing that now with the graph? So this is Charles Koch funding to higher education, institutions of higher education. You'll note that it stops at 2015. So it's actually escalated considerably since then, but the tax records haven't been gone through fully. So they are making a big project of this. And as you point out, there was some around the Goldwater period in Buchanan's own institution at Virginia, his center, and others that he went on to create over time were funded by, the likes of General Electric and Sun Oil Oil and all of these very right-leaning corporations, as well as private individuals, including the Scapes and before the Kochs and others. So there was definitely that effort going on in universities, but it's really escalated in recent years, as I think you see with that Koch sign, and also the Olin money going into law schools to try to bring in a kind of law and economics curriculum, which is designed to undermine regulation. So they have decided that and concluded that universities are crucial territory for a couple of reasons, and we need to know them. One of them is, as I mentioned, the hardcore libertarian crew is very small, right? I mean, most people do not believe ideas like this and are shocked when they hear them, so they've always had a problem getting ranks. They were like all generals and no, cavalry. So what they have done is gone into universities in a big way in order to recruit for what they call their talent pipeline. And so they bring in a lot of money, they fund all these positions for faculty, for graduate students, for professors, and try to build up their ranks, and they are doing that. They also use the academic institutions to generate ideas for the think tanks to use and to generate proposals, and the George Mason Mercatus Center is a great example of that. And then they also use the academics to play defense for the Koch operations, and particularly they've attacked climate scientists, they attack all kinds of people. They attacked me for this book, but so the academic enterprise is important to them. I'm just looking for another slide. I usually keep, so that's our friend Kevin Gentry talking about, no? Oh, right, sorry, that's something else. There he is. So he says, the students that graduate out of these higher education programs also populate the state-based think tanks and the national think tanks. They become the major staffing for our chapters, et cetera. So it is really something. I will say, though, and this is an encouraging thing, there's a wonderful group of young people who came out of these campuses that were affected and built a group called Uncoke My Campus. They do phenomenal work. I really encourage you to check out their website. It is chock full of useful documents. They've worked with faculty and students and even taxpayers in many communities to challenge what the Kochs are doing in higher education. And actually they succeeded at Wellesley, where Diane Ravitch was an alum, and so there's no longer a Koch Center there. So, this can be resisted, and it's important that it be resisted. So your first question was about their targeting academia, and the second question was, remind me?
About how this dovetails with the reaction to Goldwater's defeat. And the second was what goes inside the heads of these people.
Oh, yeah, okay. So Goldwater's defeat was stunning for them because he was really the first candidate on his domestic programs that was a libertarian. He wanted to privatize Social Security and privatize the Tennessee Valley Authority, go to flat taxes, et cetera. And he bombed everywhere where there wasn't extreme voter suppression. So the cause had to kind of really rethink things at that point and work in different ways. So this is a part of a product of that. And it's hard to think of these very extremely wealthy and kind of dominating individuals perceiving themselves as weak and embattled, but we need to understand that that is actually where this comes from. So they kept seeing themselves losing when their ideas were subjected to a vote of the citizenry, whether it was Barry Goldwater, whether it was Ronald Reagan backing up, whether it was George W. Bush bowing to the will of the people. So they decided to make that impossible, essentially, for the government to respond to the will of the people as their main goal. In terms of who does this, I get asked that a lot because, most normal people, sane people look at this and say, who would want to live in this kind of world, right? I mean, even the voters they're depending on don't want to live in this world without Social Security or Medicare or, protected air and water quality. So these are really extremely dogmatic people. I think of this libertarian dogma as a deadly dogma now, and I think we see that most clearly in the case of the climate and climate science denial. And they are also heavily based in the fossil fuel industry. So Koch Industries is grounded in fossil fuels and has been promoting climate science denial and attempts to stop action on the climate crisis. Recent research has revealed since the early 1990s, and they really got going at the time of the Kyoto Protocols, if you notice that 1997 timing, and have become active since then. So I think it's a combination of this libertarian libertarian dogma that can see no good in government, so it has to deny any problem that would lead to government action, and the self-interest of trying to defend this indefensible industry. And in fact, one pundit, Chris Hayes, has a really brilliant piece saying, if you want to understand what's happening now with the fossil fuel industry, the only example in history of equivalent sunk investment and anticipated loss of profit is the Southern slaveholder class in the run-up to the Civil War. And if you think about what they were willing to do to preserve their property rights, as they saw them, in human beings, to bring, the horror on those human beings and then a civil war on the country, maybe that helps us understand how determined the fossil fuel sector is to get its way. So I find it hard to explain, but that's, in a nutshell, the best I can do.
We take one over here.
Do you have any examples of what constitutional amendments or constitutional changes they would have in mind if they had a convention? And number two, one Koch brothers passed, the other's still up there, and there's rumors that the next generation, I don't know, is it just the facade that they're supposed to be the more kinder, gentler libertarians? So your comment on what the future.
Sure. Yeah. So, as far as the amendments, there's actually a person named Mark Levin, a legal scholar who's worked with Ed Meese, who wrote a book called The Liberty Amendments. It actually sold 3 million copies, ended up on all New York Times, all 3 bestseller lists, and got almost no attention from the newspaper or the editors. So that will give you a good a good sample, but it includes a balanced budget amendment, so something that many people actually think, well, that seems like a good idea, keep the government within its means, until people find out what that would actually mean in practice, which would mean the death of programs they care greatly about. But to give you a sense of the radicalism of this effort, one of the other proposals that Levin has in this book is repealing the 17th Amendment. Now, I know it sent me scrambling back to my Constitution too. What's the 17th Amendment? You have to recall these things. The 17th Amendment was a progressive era victory to enable the people to directly elect their U.S. senators instead of have them chosen by state legislatures, which are much easier for corporations to capture, and that's why the progressives wanted the people to elect the senators. So it is really such an attempt to, again, institute this system of essentially private property supremacy or corporate supremacy, and you'll see they also want to put voter ID in the Constitution, et cetera. There are various different efforts, though. Some of them will focus on only a few and promise we can have those, but anybody who studied this, and any legal scholar not on the Koch payrolls will tell you that any constitutional convention would by definition be a runaway convention because there's no way to control the outcome. So Common Cause, if you're interested in this, actually has terrific material on their website. They've been leading on this effort, and if you just Google Common Cause and Article 5 or Constitutional Convention, you'll find some of their really helpful reports on this. And the second question? So the future of the Koch network. Yeah, so I get asked this, particularly after David Koch died last year. Charles Koch has always been the more determined ideological one. He's the one who stayed in Wichita, who has, made all this happen. So David, I don't think it makes much difference at all. Charles is 83, I think, now. And so despite his best rigorous health routines, I think will be mortal like the rest of us. So he has been grooming his son, Charles Jr., to inherit the throne. There are reports that he is not nearly as, fixated or as effective as his father is. But quite frankly, at this point, they have produced so many kind of clones in these operatives among the academics, et cetera, that I think that the enterprise will be self-perpetuating, although I think as in any time when, the monarch dies, there'll be kind of a scramble for power, and as Leonard Cohen said, cracks are how the light gets through, right? So I think, we'll learn a little bit more about it and there'll be a shakeup, but I do think it will continue until it is stopped by citizens learning about this project and acting and organizing to take back our government and put it under the people's control and monitoring. Yeah.
Over there.
Oops.
So I had kind of stopped looking back further than the Powell Amendment. So thank you for this history. It's very helpful. But I think aside from the fact that you've got to give them their due for brilliance,
Yes.
strategic thinking, and having the long game in mind, the question is, what are the strategies that we can use? I'd love to believe that sunlight is the greatest disinfectant, but we also have the situation now in society with everyone listening to their own echo,
Yeah.
right? Through separate media. The days of Walter Cronkite and everyone watching that program are dead.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm concerned that how we get information like this out so that it is understood and accepted, given the current status of
Yeah.
what we listen to.
Thank you. I think that's really important. And it is true that some roughly 30% of the population is deep into sort of the Fox, Breitbart kind of network, which scholars have shown is not a news network. In fact, it's an identity creation and provocation enterprise that deliberately kind of cultivates an embattled white identity and tries to make its viewers believe that any kind of liberal or moderate or other people are contemptuous of these viewers, are looking down upon them, are looking to take things from them, etc. And if you look at cognitive psychology, evolutionary biology, which they have also studied, it's essentially they activate what some people call the reptilian brain, where you provoke a stress response and people don't think very carefully or rationally, right? They get angry, they get stressed, they want to fight, they want to defend. So that is a problem, because there's got to be ultimately a way to break through that. But I also teach the history of social movements, and so that does lead to me thinking about strategy in this context. And I think, and my friend Carolyn, who's here, Carolyn Fine, was telling me earlier about someone who uses the metric 30, 40, 30, that there are 30 people on 30% on one side, 30% on the other side, 40 in between. We have yet to really inform and activate the 30% who are the key people who could really make the change in this country. Many people are active, they're doing different things, we can talk more about that. We can also reach that 40% who are persuadable, who are listening, who are thinking. So I think that is crucial. And in fact, the other at least 60% are still in the regular media environment that goes from right to left, but actually is fact-based. We could talk more about some of the research on that later. But so that is encouraging to me. I tend to think of this in terms of concentric circles, that each one of us, for example, in this room, knows a lot of people, is part of different networks, etc. If we each think, who do I know? What groups am I a part of? How can I, alert people to what is happening and perhaps try to move some people into action? If you keep doing that, it will snowball and get to what we need. I've also learned through the speaking that I've been doing over the last 2 years that many of the groups who have been working hard in the trenches and feeling the brunt of this agenda really understand that we can't keep doing the same things in the same way and expect that we're going to get better results. So many people on the progressive side are now also starting to think about, we need to have a long-term vision, we need to get out of the silos and start working in more integrated ways, and above all, we need to make structural democracy reform a top priority for everyone. And there are projects that are involving labor unions, community organizations, the NAACP, Planned Parenthood, environmental groups who are doing precisely this, saying we have to get the dark money out of politics, we have to get automatic voter registration so that everybody can participate more easily. We have to do a lot of things like that. And ironically, thanks to the Trump presidency, he's woken so many people up that there is huge energy to do this. So we've seen that with the growth of the indivisible groups, the Move On groups, all the women who've become active and run for office. So I actually feel, optimism is a little too simple perhaps, but I do feel hope. I do absolutely see a way out of this, and I think that this is precisely the kind of crisis we have faced before in our history. In the 1860s, when those original property supremacists were trying to win, and in the 1930s, when another group of property supremacists did not want to take action to alleviate what was happening in the Great Depression. In those cases, the vast majority of the population did move into action, did support significant change, and we renewed democracy in quite dramatic ways that worked for generations ahead. So I honestly believe that we can do that now, but it is going to require people seeing the need to doing it and alerting people in their networks and their worlds.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm a repurposed, not retired, historian from Wellesley. And the Freedom Project that you referred to actually still exists.
Oh, okay.
At the college. So despite whatever
Uh-huh.
Dr. Ravitch and a bunch of alums did talk about, it still actually is ongoing. And it raises, I think, a really interesting problem, which is if we say that the function of a college and a university is the freedom of ideas, and then we don't have a range of ideas allowed, that ideology becomes really difficult to struggle against when groups like the Freedom Project bring in very right people, because it is true, I taught at Wellesley for 3 decades, we did not bring in very many people on the right. So I think it's important to think about how we deal with the idea of a freedom of speech movement at the same time as we try to keep this money out of the universities and out of the colleges.
Thank you. That's a really good point. And one of the things that Koch My Campus has done really well, and you can find this on their website, working together with the American Association of University Professors, the AUP, some folks in the American Federation of Teachers, I think also the NEA, they came up with a model donor agreement, and you can find it, you can get it on their website, and basically, you know, because colleges do need money at this point. They're very expensive enterprises, and many public schools also especially need money because they've been starved by state legislatures associated with these guys, as in my state. So there may be donor money coming in, but it doesn't have to be on the donor's terms, and it can be subject to serious sunshine, not giving them the ability to do things. And just to give you a sense of how toxic this Koch investment has been to many places that have accepted the money, they had donor agreements at Florida State University that allowed the Kochs to actually vet research topics, not, you know, participate in hiring, but also choose the research topics that were and were not okay for students to do. And at George Mason, the flagship campus that I wrote about, where Unkoch started, through Freedom of Information Act request, they were able to get donor agreements for hires in the university, and found that in one particular case, the donor chose a tenured faculty member and had the ability to revoke the contract if that person didn't deliver what the donor was hoping for. Many of the other ones were corrupt. And also the Federalist Society was funneling in money to the renamed Scalia School of Law at George Mason through a vehicle that I believe it was the Washington Post said was the kind of sort of camouflage legal vehicle used for money laundering. So there's been a lot of good journalism about this from the Washington Post and other places that you can find on the Unkoch My Campus website. But I think it is important for us also to realize the distinctions between freedom of speech and academic freedom. And Joan Scott, a feminist historian and thinker and kind of public intellectual, has written about this very well and been prominent in working with the AUP about it. But they also talk about freedom of speech. So they will bring in these provocative, horrible, racist speakers like that Milos. I refuse to remember his name because all he ever did was provoke. He did nothing that should lead to his invitation to a campus. Or Ann Coulter, you know, who's called liberals traitors and put out all this incendiary stuff. So they actually bring these provocative speakers to campus knowing that they will provoke good young people who are anti-racist to behave badly. And then they have a group called the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, ACTA, which organizes wealthy alumni and trustees to then go to the university where this happened and say, see, this is why you need a Koch network, a Koch center, a freedom center, whatever they want to call it, on your campus, because your students are behaving badly and your faculty haven't taught them their constitutional manners. So it's really a big issue. There's more and more research about this and teaching, but they are this is not academic freedom for speakers like that to speak, right? Academic freedom is supposed to protect legitimate, serious research and inquiry. Anyway, so lots of things to consider, but again, the Uncoke My Campus website is a fantastic resource of information and primary sources, and also that donor agreement. Yeah.
Hi. From what you've said and from what I've read in your book, it seems like the far right has outflanked us in almost every way, and I do not see your reason for hope. And I'm wondering if you can share with me some things I can do, a few specific things that would be effective in unchaining democracy and reversing this terrible trend that's really sinking our country.
Yeah, thank you, and I'm sorry that I left you with that feeling. I have to say that I've had my fair share of dark days myself in this, but one thing that I hold on to, which I think is actually the most important finding of my research, and I want to underscore here, these people are doing what they're doing in the way that they're doing it because they understand that really they are a permanent minority. That the rest of us, the great majority, does not want to live in the world that they are trying to create. And if we knew what was going on, if we understood what they were doing, we would absolutely shut it down and stop it. So I think that is important. And people have said over the years, there are ultimately two sources of power: organized money and organized people, right? They have organized money very well, and their organized money has bought them some organized people. But the vast majority is on our side. The vast majority of the talent, frankly, is on our side. Okay, I shouldn't take Donald Trump as totally fused with them, but he's certainly doing a lot for them. You know who he's had to the White House for cultural talent? First, remember back to the Clinton years, the Obama years, all the great poets, artists, musicians, writers, thinkers. Donald Trump brought Ted Nugent. Just to me, that's a metaphor. Just look at the conventions and the music they have and the thing. We have so much on our side. We have never seen resources like the resources we have on our side now in history if we organize them in a good way. If we had a strategy and if we learned to row together, we could do this. I teach social movements. Frederick Douglass spoke in the early version of this church. You know how many people the abolition movement had when they started? The American Anti-Slavery Society? 33 in a room. Freed, escaped African Americans who understood that they were not chattel, who didn't accept that system, who rebelled against that. But in the beginning, when they created this interracial organization, they had 33 people in a room. And every single institution in the society was against them. The courts, higher education, the newspapers, the churches, every mainstream institution upheld slavery or told them to shut up. They were mobbed by gentlemen, mobs in Boston for trying to speak. It was extraordinary what they did. Anyway, that was the opposition they faced. And yet, they persisted, to use the language of our time. So if they could do that against those odds and make anti-slavery, not anti-racism, there's all kinds of problems in this history, but at least anti-slavery, the credo of the country, such that I can't even teach undergraduates today. They don't understand how slaveholders ever imagined they had a right to do what they did, right? It's a challenge to an educator. That change was so significant. We can do it. But to do it, we've got to think and act in different ways than we have been doing it. But I fully believe that it is possible, or I wouldn't be standing here giving you false hope.
Right, and on that note of hope, I think we should give Nancy a round of applause.
Thank you for coming out. It's wonderful to see you all.